Truth never arrives gently. It tears through certainty and exposes the scaffolding beneath our beliefs. And nowhere is this rupture clearer than when we confront the quiet, devastating insight of Hume. The mind is not the sovereign we imagine, but a flickering apparatus of habits, expectations, and fragile constructions. Long before the vocabulary of cognitive science existed, he revealed what the modern world still resists admitting. We do not think as clearly as we think we do, and our most cherished convictions rest on foundations of sand. In an age rushing toward 2025, this admission is not weakness. It is the beginning of philosophical honesty. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. But let us return to the fracture Hume forces us to face. His challenge is not abstract. It is a direct confrontation with the very machinery by which we interpret experience. He strips away illusion with the same calm precision a surgeon uses to reveal the wound beneath the skin. He demands we see the mind as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in doing so, he positions himself outside his century, speaking into ours with unsettling accuracy. This is where the real inquiry begins, not in admiration of a philosopher, but in the uncomfortable recognition that his diagnosis is still ours. What does it mean to live inside a mind built on habits, driven by passions, and haunted by uncertainties it cannot resolve? That question is the doorway into the body of this study, and it is where we now turn as the argument deepens, sharpens, and confronts us without mercy. Truth is never what we think it is. It emerges only after it destroys the illusions we cling to for survival. Hume forces this destruction from the very first question he dares to ask. Why do we believe the future resembles the past? The question seems too simple, almost trivial, yet it rips open the hidden machinery of the mind. Before the rise of modern science, before the world crowned prediction as a new religion, he understood the terrifying truth beneath our confidence. He confronted the fact that nothing in reality guarantees continuation, and he exposed how deeply we fear this emptiness. In that early century, when people still believed knowledge could rest on certainty, he revealed that certainty was only a mask human beings invented to soften the blow of existence. His voice stands against the arrogance of rationalism, not to crush reason, but to free it from self-worship. Long before the world entered the age of data, he saw how fragile the human thirst for assurance really is. The first claim he makes undermines the foundation we walk on every day. We assume that what has happened will continue to happen. We assume that the world behaves consistently. Yet this assumption has no logical ground. It is not derived from proof, but from repetition. The mind grows accustomed to patterns, and from that comfort it builds expectation. Habit becomes doctrine. Familiarity becomes law. He strips this mechanism bare and demands that we look at it without flinching. We do not infer the future because we grasp some hidden necessity in the world. We infer it because the absence of inference would terrify us. A misunderstanding often follows his argument, a belief that science escapes this weakness. But science stands on induction as well. It refines observation, but it never escapes the leap from what has been to what will be. Even the most rigorous theory requires the same fragile bridge of expectation. His conclusion strikes with existential force. The world promises nothing, and the mind invents promises because it cannot bear the alternative. He pushes the blade deeper by revealing another truth. Prediction is not confidence. Prediction is fear in disguise. The modern brain, shaped by evolution to anticipate danger, despises uncertainty because uncertainty exposes the precariousness of life. Hume recognized this long before psychology named it. The brain constructs patterns not because the patterns are real, but because unpredictability threatens the stability of self. When we measure, forecast, analyze, we are not mastering the world. We are calming the internal storm. Misinterpretation arises when people claim that predictive success proves objective understanding. To Hume, success only shows how desperately the mind seeks coherence. And from this emerges a conclusion sharper than skepticism. Human beings do not seek truth first. They seek safety. Truth is tolerated only when it does not undermine that safety. His third thrust dismantles the illusion of necessity that saturates human thinking. We speak of causal chains as though the world is bound by an invisible force compelling events to follow in strict order. But what we actually perceive is only succession. We see events occurring together and assume a binding power between them. This assumption does not come from reason, but from psychological conditioning. The misunderstanding he attacks here is the belief that the universe itself displays causal necessity. No, necessity is projected outward by the mind, not discovered. We experience repetition, then we imagine the glue that holds repetition in place. From this, he draws a bleak and liberating conclusion. The world is not tied together by the laws we believe in. The laws are our attempt to resist the terror of randomness. We cling to order because disorder exposes how alone we are in the cosmos. It is ironic that in the age of 2025, when humanity boasts of technological mastery, this ancient fear remains untouched. We hide it behind sophisticated tools, economic forecasts, digital dashboards, market predictors, personal analytics. Entire industries exist to give us the illusion of control. We read predictions as though they reveal the future rather than soothe our dread. Technology has not solved uncertainty. It has only decorated it. And the danger is greater now, because the decoration is convincing. When an app charts our habits, we believe our lives are stable. When an algorithm anticipates our desires, we believe the self is consistent. But these systems depend on the same inductive leap Hume exposed centuries ago. They cannot escape it. They only disguise it with elegance. And beneath the elegance remains the same trembling creature, the human mind, terrified of not knowing. The psychological core of this fear reaches deeper than daily anxiety. It touches the architecture of existence. We believe that identity depends on continuity. We believe that meaning requires predictability. We believe that choice makes sense only if the world behaves within certain boundaries. If the future breaks free from the past, the self risks dissolving. Hume forces us to see that this dissolution has always been possible. The mind negotiates with reality by pretending reality is stable. It constructs models to silence the terror of unpredictability. It invents patterns so that the heart can breathe. Yet the heart never fully believes what the mind insists on. That is the quiet tension at the center of human experience. We hold two truths at once. We know the world is uncertain, and we live as though it is not. This contradiction shapes our deepest conflicts. We desire freedom, but fear the chaos that freedom exposes. We desire meaning, but cannot bear the vulnerability required to create it. This inner conflict becomes visible in a symbolic figure of the modern age, the forecaster. He represents the intersection of fear and intellect. His work appears rational, precise, scientific. But behind every chart lies a psychological need older than philosophy. He is not simply predicting events, he is negotiating with dread. When markets collapse, he revises models, not because models failed, but because stability must be restored. When trends shift unexpectedly, he recalibrates, not to understand the world, but to repair the illusion that the world can be understood. Hume would look at him and see not a master of reality, but a mirror of humanity. Through this figure, we see how deeply dependent we are on the belief that tomorrow can be contained within the logic of yesterday. The forecaster does not escape uncertainty. He merely organizes it into a shape the mind can endure. From these scattered revelations, a single thread emerges. The problem of induction is not a technical puzzle in philosophy. It is a diagnosis of the human condition. It exposes the fragile architecture of our expectations. It reveals that our trust in the world is not grounded in evidence, but in the emotional necessity to go on living. It binds Hume to the later existentialists who claim that meaning must be forged in the face of an indifferent universe. It aligns him with thinkers who argue that human beings chase patterns, not because patterns are true, but because patterns protect us from despair. Once we understand this, we see that uncertainty is not the enemy. It is the fundamental landscape of existence. The enemy is the illusion that we are guaranteed anything at all. And when this illusion collapses, when we finally accept that the world offers no anchor, something unexpected happens. A different kind of clarity rises. Not comfort, not reassurance, but clarity. The recognition that courage begins precisely where certainty ends. The recognition that life becomes real only when we stop demanding guarantees. The recognition that the search for understanding must continue, even when understanding cannot promise safety. At this threshold, Hume leaves us standing, stripped yet awake, forced to confront the condition we have always tried to escape. And from this confrontation, another question begins to stir, one that moves beyond the problem of induction and pierces even deeper into the architecture of human thought. demanding that we face what we think we know about the very structure of experience itself. Yet the question that rises from that threshold does not soften, it sharpens. If we cannot trust the continuity of events, what do we actually see when we claim to understand the world? Hume forces us into a darker realization. We do not perceive causes. We do not witness necessity. We witness only sequences. And from these sequences, the mind forges chains that do not exist outside its own hunger for structure. What we call causation is not a feature of the world, but a projection of expectation. And once this truth surfaces, every confident claim about how reality operates begins to fracture under the weight of its own presumption. The mind does not wait for proof before inventing order. It leaps. It stitches together fragments. It constructs narratives as quickly as the eye blinks. We see one event follow another, and we declare that the first produced the second. But this declaration is not observation. It is interpretation. Worse, it is an interpretation driven not by insight, but by the primal urge to reduce threat. Hume reveals that the idea of a necessary connection between events is an illusion we impose because the alternative is unbearable. Without this illusion, the world becomes a storm of unrelated flashes, a chaos with no anchor. The human mind refuses to live inside that chaos, so it manufactures the glue that binds one moment to the next. Reason arrives later, only to baptize what instinct has already fabricated. Before modern psychology gave names to cognitive bias, before behavioral science exposed pattern seeking as the brain's default habit, Hume saw through the trick. He saw that the mind is incapable of leaving events unexplained. It would rather invent a false cause than accept uncertainty. The misunderstanding he dismantles is the assumption that our explanations mirror reality. They do not. They mirror fear. They mirror desire. They mirror the need to believe that the world is intelligible. Once this is stripped away, we face a truth that threatens the foundation of knowledge. Our certainty is built on stories we mistake for laws. This becomes painfully clear when we examine how quickly the mind leaps to causal conclusions. A sound in the dark becomes danger. A glance becomes judgment. A coincidence becomes fate. We are always forming links. We do it because linking protects us from the void. The psychological mechanism is ancient. The brain evolved to detect patterns even when none exist, because in the ancestral world, missing a real threat was more fatal than imagining an unreal one. Hume understood the cost of this mechanism long before evolution was articulated. He recognized that our instinct to connect events is not evidence of truth, but evidence of survival strategy. We see the world not as it is, but as we must see it to keep moving. This illusion of necessity is the soil where superstition grows. When lightning strikes after a ritual, the ritual becomes causal. When misfortune follows a thought, the thought becomes powerful. When the world trembles in coincidence, we transform coincidence into meaning. Hume strips all this away and reveals the naked mind beneath its own inventions. He exposes how desperately we cling to imaginary threads because the alternative is the terrifying possibility that events do not answer to us at all. Nowhere is this more visible than in the modern obsession with conspiratorial thinking. The 21st century mind, saturated with information and starved of certainty, grasps at any narrative that promises coherence. Conspiracy is the child of the same. Psychological hunger, Hume diagnosed. When reality feels fragmented, people sew fragments together with a thread of invented causality. They prefer a sinister explanation to no explanation. They prefer an orchestrated plot to randomness. They prefer a hidden puppeteer to an indifferent world. The misunderstanding at the heart of conspiracy is the belief that connection implies intention. But as Hume would bluntly remind us, repetition does not imply necessity, and coincidence does not imply design. The same mechanism underlies social prejudice. When a handful of experiences confirm an expectation, the mind declares a universal rule. When certain faces repeat in certain contexts, the brain fabricates a causal link. Prejudice is not born from reason. It is born from the ancient reflex to simplify complexity. It arises from the same fear of ambiguity that drives all false causation. The mind wants quick conclusions. It wants templates. It wants certainty, even when certainty becomes harmful. Hume's insight cuts directly through this. What we call understanding is often a shortcut built from limited perception and amplified by emotional need. Even the inner life is shaped by this illusion. We misinterpret ourselves just as easily as we misinterpret the world. If we fail twice, we declare ourselves failures. If we succeed once, we declare ourselves changed. If a single wound repeats its pain, we build a narrative about destiny. The self crafts causes to explain its own suffering, its own longing, its own confusion. But these causes are often myths. Hume's challenge is to recognize that much of what we believe about ourselves is merely habit stacked on top of fear. The narrative of personal identity becomes yet another chain we forged to impose order on an internal landscape that refuses to obey. This realization does not weaken us. It exposes the weakness we were already living with. Causation, in Hume's view, is not an objective truth, but a psychological. Comfort. It is the mind defending itself against the instability of existence. It is the scaffolding we build so that reality does not collapse into meaningless fragmentation. And once we see that, the moral implications deepen. If causation is not inherent in events, it becomes a mirror revealing how human beings interpret the world. It shows that our judgments, our beliefs, our reactions are shaped less by what things are and more by what we need them to be. We prefer a world with intention, even malevolent intention, over a world without coherence. We prefer explanation over truth. This raises a stark question. What happens to meaning when causation is exposed as psychological rather than metaphysical? Meaning becomes something we assign, not something we uncover. Purpose becomes an invention, not a discovery. Stability becomes a temporary illusion made necessary by survival. Hume does not deny the usefulness of these illusions. He simply reveals their nature. He demands that we confront the fact that understanding the world, is inseparable from understanding the mind that interprets it. And the mind is not a neutral observer. It is an anxious storyteller. In the age of 2025, this truth becomes even more evident. Algorithms track behavior and attempt to predict choices. Yet these predictions often reinforce imagined patterns rather than reveal genuine causation. Social media amplifies the illusion of connection, linking events that share only proximity in time. The digital world accelerates the mind's instinct to see intention everywhere. Virality becomes meaning. Correlation becomes conspiracy. Trends become destiny. The world feels more causal than ever because the noise has been arranged into patterns that gratify our psychological cravings. But the underlying fragility remains untouched. We still see only sequences, never necessity. The existential weight of this realization presses hardest when we attempt to navigate uncertainty. The mind wants to believe that misfortune has reasons. It wants to believe that suffering follows rules. It wants to believe that if we interpret events correctly, we can avoid chaos. But Hume warns that this is wishful thinking disguised as insight. The world does not distribute suffering according to logic. The world does not adhere to the stories we craft. And to demand that it does is to imprison ourselves inside illusions of causality that ultimately betray us. A symbolic figure emerges here, mirroring the forecaster of the previous chapter, the interpreter. This figure cannot tolerate ambiguity. He reads intention into every gesture, every silence, every accident. He believes understanding means discovering the cause behind all things. But what he discovers instead is the echo of his own fear. The more he seeks necessity, the more reality resists. Hume would say he's not deciphering the world, he's projecting himself onto it. Through him, we see the danger of a mind that cannot accept the possibility that some events are merely events without deeper meaning or hidden force. From these reflections, the synthesis becomes unavoidable. Causation, which we treat as the backbone of knowledge, is actually a psychological strategy. It exists because we need it, not because the world demands it. Hume's revelation does not destroy the possibility of understanding. It clarifies the nature of understanding. It shows that to know the world, we must first confront the fears that shape our perception of it. We must recognize that the link between events may tell us more about ourselves than about reality. And once we accept this, a more honest relationship with truth becomes possible. But as soon as this clarity settles, a new fault line opens. If causation is shaped by emotion more than by reason, if explanation emerges from instinct rather than from logic, then the authority of rational thought itself begins to tremble. What we call understanding may be nothing more than a servant of deeper forces that move within us. Forces we prefer not to acknowledge because they reveal how limited our intellect truly is. And it is at this trembling edge that another question begins to surface, demanding that we confront not only the illusions of the world, but the illusions of the mind that claims to master it. And it is at this trembling edge where the mind senses that its own constructions may be illusions, that Hume delivers another blow. Reason is not sovereign. It does not command the mind. It does not shape our lives with the clarity we pretend it has. Reason follows emotion. Reason obeys desire. Reason is the servant we mistake for a king. Hume names this truth without hesitation. And the moment he does, an entire architecture of human pride begins to collapse. For if reason is not the master of our actions, then the stories we tell about our rationality are simply ways of avoiding the deeper forces that actually move us. The human mind does not want to hear this. It prefers to imagine itself governed by logic, clarity, order. It clings to the fantasy that decisions emerge from deliberation rather than impulse. Yet Hume strips this fantasy layer by layer. Before neuroscience proved it, before behavioral science cataloged bias after bias, he saw that emotion initiates and reason justifies. Action erupts from instinct, and only afterward does thought rush in to provide an explanation that feels noble enough to hide the truth. The misunderstanding he confronts is ancient, the belief that humans think their way into action. But the reality is harsher. We act because something within us moves, and then we invent a narrative to pretend we chose it through careful judgment. This is not a flaw in the mind. It is the structure of the mind. Reason is not designed to command. It is designed to interpret. It makes sense of impulses after the fact. It furnishes the world with coherence so that we are not shattered by the raw immediacy of emotion. But coherence does not mean control. Clarity does not mean dominance. When Hume declares that reason is the slave of the passions, he is not insulting reason. He is describing its function. It responds. It explains. It aligns with whatever desire or fear has already determined the direction of action. The conclusion is both brutal and liberating. We live not by calculations, but by currents that rise from beneath awareness. To see this clearly is to confront the hidden hierarchy inside the self. At the surface lies deliberation. Beneath that lies preference. Beneath preference lies desire. Beneath desire lies fear. And beneath fear lies the raw pulse of existence, the urge simply to continue. Reason decorates these layers with elegant structures, but it cannot alter their foundation. This becomes undeniable in the moments where emotion overtakes thought entirely, when panic overrides logic, when longing eclipses restraint, when anger fractures restraint. In those moments, the illusion of rational control crumbles, revealing the machinery that has always operated underneath. Hume saw this, and he dared to build an entire philosophy around the truth that no one wants to acknowledge. We do not think our way into being. We feel our way into being. Modern life, despite its sophistication, has not escaped this dynamic. In the world of 2025, people trust algorithms, data points, and metrics as symbols of rationality. Yet their decisions betray deeper impulses. A financial choice disguised as strategy is often the echo of greed or fear. A career move dressed in logical justification is frequently a response to insecurity. Even technological progress, which presents itself as rational optimization, is animated by desire for control, status, and recognition. Hume's insight stretches across centuries because the core of the human psyche has not changed. We still pretend that explanations cause actions, when in truth, actions demand explanations. This inversion reveals why rational failure does not produce enlightenment. When people recognize that their decisions were all wise, they do not abandon the belief in their rationality. Instead, they rewrite their stories to protect the illusion. They insist they evaluated the wrong data, misunderstood the situation, or made an exception in a moment of weakness. Rarely do they admit that emotion directed them from the beginning. The resistance to this admission is profound because accepting emotional primacy feels like surrendering control. But Hume argues the opposite. Clarity begins when we stop lying about the structure of our choices. Only then can reason operate honestly, not as a tyrant pretending to rule, but as an advisor who finally knows his place. The consequences of misunderstanding reason become visible in the quiet conflicts of daily life. A person knows they should save money, but spends impulsively. A person knows a relationship is unhealthy, yet remains bound to it. A person knows habit is destructive, yet continues indulging it. These moments are not lapses in intelligence. They are demonstrations of Hume's claim. Knowledge does not govern behavior. Emotion does. The mind can recognize truth and still fail to act on it, because recognition is not the force that moves us. Movement requires feeling. Action requires desire. This is why the phenomenon of knowing but not doing is universal. It is not a weakness of character. It is a revelation of internal structure. The self is not unified. It is a battlefield where impulses and judgments collide, and judgment often loses. This collision becomes even more evident in moments of internal contradiction. A person may long for freedom while craving security. They may desire success while fearing exposure. They may seek intimacy while resisting vulnerability. Reason observes these contradictions, but cannot resolve them. Emotion continues to generate opposing currents, and reason attempts to harmonize what cannot be harmonized. What we call maturity is not the triumph of reason over emotion, but the recognition that these forces must be navigated rather than conquered. Hume's insight points toward humility, not defeat. The mind becomes clearer when it accepts that clarity is not dominance, but understanding. Financial decisions provide a sharp example. Investors claim to follow analysis, yet markets rise and fall according to waves of fear and euphoria. Logic becomes the mask worn by impulse. Entire economies move not because of rational evaluation, but because of collective emotion. The illusion of rational systems collapses when mass psychology reveals its power. Hume would say the spectacle is predictable because groups follow the same internal structure as individuals. Reason does not drive crowds, emotion does. And when emotion moves, reason becomes its chronicler, not its controller. The same pattern appears in the subtler struggles of the inner world. A person may study philosophy, read psychology, understand cognitive bias, and still find themselves repeating the same patterns of pain. They may grasp the logic of their suffering and remain unable to escape it. Understanding does not automatically change behavior because understanding is not the axis of the self. Emotion is. This truth is difficult to swallow because it undermines the pride we place in our intelligence. But Hume's challenge is gentle in its ruthlessness. Intelligence without emotional insight is powerless. Thought without awareness of passion becomes mere ornament. If reason is a servant, then what is its purpose? Hume does not reduce it to insignificance. Instead, he assigns it a role that is subtler and more honest. Reason clarifies, it organizes, it illuminates. It allows us to see the contours of our impulses more sharply. It does not choose our ends, but it refines the means by which we pursue them. It does not command emotion, but it can prevent emotion from devouring us. When reason understands its dependence on passion, it can finally cooperate with the internal forces rather than disguise them. True wisdom, then, is not the suppression of emotion, but the alignment of emotion with understanding. This alignment requires a kind of existential courage. To live honestly, according to Hume's insight, is to admit that the self is not fully transparent to itself. It is to accept that decisions are shaped by internal storms we barely comprehend. It is to recognize that rationality is fragile and that the self must confront the emotional roots of its choices. Many resist this because it dissolves the illusion of autonomy. But the dissolution opens a deeper form of freedom, the freedom to examine the desires that actually rule us, to question them, to reshape them, to refuse the ones that diminish us. Reason becomes a tool, not for domination, but for liberation. The modern world, despite its technological exterior, is still ruled by unacknowledged emotions. Social conflicts intensify not because people lack information, but because information cannot pacify the passions that drive their identities. Political debates escalate not because logic fails, but because the emotional foundations of belief remain untouched. Hume's insight, therefore, remains indispensable. If we want to understand human behavior, we must look past arguments and into the emotional infrastructure beneath them. The mind justifies what the heart has already chosen, whether or not the choice can withstand scrutiny. This raises a final question with unsettling force. If reason cannot command emotion, and if emotion shapes both belief and action, then how stable is our sense of self? What anchors the identity we claim to possess? Reason cannot secure it. Emotion shifts. Desire transforms. Fear evolves. If the currents that shape us are in constant motion, then the self may be less a solid structure than a temporary gathering of impulses passing through the same space. And once this possibility emerges, the ground beneath identity begins to tremble, opening the way to an even more radical insight waiting just beyond the edge of this realization. And once the ground beneath identity begins to tremble, the illusion we protect most fiercely begins to crack. For Hume goes further than exposing the weakness of reason or the dominance of emotion. He reveals that the self itself, the thing we assume to be solid and continuous, is nothing more than a shifting constellation of perceptions. There is no core, no permanent essence, no inner sovereign directing the flow of experience. What we call the self is a bundle of sensations tied together by memory and habit, not by substance. It is a story told over and over until the telling feels like truth. And the moment we confront this, the familiar stability of personhood dissolves into something more fluid, more fragile, and more honest. The human mind resists this insight with more force than almost any other. We need to believe in a stable self, because without it, the world becomes uninhabitable. If the self is only a sequence of impressions, then what anchors responsibility, desire, purpose, memory, or meaning? But Hume shows that this question emerges from misunderstanding. The illusion of a permanent self arises because perceptions arrive in rapid succession, each blending into the next. Like frames in a film, they create the image of continuity when none exists. We mistake the flow for the thing that flows. We confuse movement with identity. The psychological mechanism operates so smoothly that the illusion feels natural. But the feeling of stability is not evidence of stability. To see the truth requires stripping away the comfort we normally grant ourselves. When we examine any moment of consciousness directly, we find only sensation, thought, feeling, image. None of these persists. Each arrives, fades, and is replaced. There is no observer behind them. There is only the sequence. The misunderstanding Hume dismantles is the belief that there must be an internal witness, an unchanging subject holding the stream together. But the stream holds itself. Coherence is created by memory, not by metaphysical substance. The self becomes less a thing and more a pattern, less a being and more a process. This insight does not diminish human experience. It clarifies its texture. The instability we try so hard to hide has always shaped us. The self changes from moment to moment, shaped by the interplay of emotion, perception, and circumstance. One version of us desires what another version rejects. One version fears what another embraces. One version remembers while another forgets. Identity becomes a negotiation rather than a possession. Hume's view forces us to confront this fragmentation, not as failure, but as truth. The self is not a statue, but a flame. It burns continuously, yet its shape is never the same. Modern psychology, long after Hume, echoes this with its understanding of the mind as modular, dynamic, layered. Depth psychology adds symbolic language to the same insight. The psyche contains multiplicities, shifting constellations of drives that compete and cooperate. Even contemplative traditions, from which Hume was far removed, describe the self as a process that only appears stable because we grasp at it. Though their vocabularies differ, the convergence is unmistakable. The idea of a single, unchanging self collapses under scrutiny, leaving behind the more honest recognition that identity is a moving center, not a fixed point. This recognition becomes especially confronting in the age of 2025, when the digital world amplifies the fluidity of identity. Social media fragments the self into curated images, each tailored for an audience. Personal branding turns identity into performance. Avatars, profiles, and histories shift depending on context. People feel the erosion of a stable self, yet cling to the hope that beneath the layers there is something solid. But the very anxiety they feel is the echo of Hume's insight. The self is not dissolving because of technology. Technology merely exposes its original fragility. This fragility appears vividly during moments of existential disruption. A person experiencing loss feels their identity shatter because the framework that held their perceptions together collapses. A person in crisis feels transformed because the emotions shaping their sense of self rearrange themselves. A person who changes beliefs, relationships, or environments discovers that the self they thought was stable can be replaced by another almost without warning. These moments frighten us because they reveal the discontinuity we spend our lives concealing. But Hume does not present this as a tragedy. It is an invitation to see identity not as a prison, but as a field of possibility. Yet this possibility cuts both ways. Just as the self can evolve, it can fracture. Just as it can expand, it can erode. When a person feels lost, they often speak of not knowing who they are. But this question presupposes a self waiting to be found, a hidden essence preserved beneath confusion. Hume challenges this assumption. There is no essence to uncover. There is only the shifting pattern of thought and sensation that must be understood in its movement, not its imaginary core. To seek a final identity is to chase a shadow. To recognize the absence of a fixed identity is to confront reality without illusion. This confrontation reveals the psychological cost of believing in a permanent self. When identity is treated as fixed, any deviation feels like failure. Change becomes betrayal. Confusion becomes weakness. Growth becomes a threat to stability. But when identity is understood as fluid, change becomes inevitable, and the self becomes something to be cultivated rather than defended. This shift in perspective demands humility. It demands courage. It demands accepting that we do not fully know ourselves, because there is no singular self to know. A symbolic figure can illuminate this. Consider the person who reinvents themselves after a profound rupture. They emerge with new values, new passions, new fears. Those who knew them before may insist that the change is superficial, that the true self still lies beneath the transformation. But Hume would argue the opposite. The transformation is the self. The new pattern of perceptions is not a mask hiding an essence. It is the current configuration of identity. The self does not survive change. It is constituted by change. To cling to an older version of oneself is to cling to a ghost. This understanding reshapes how we interpret memory. We believe memory binds identity by creating continuity. But memory itself is unstable, selective, reconstructed. It reflects the needs of the present more than the events of the past. When memory shifts, identity shifts with it. The stories we tell about ourselves become tools for coherence, not mirrors of truth. Hume's insight thus exposes the narrative nature of selfhood. We are authors, pretending to be archivists. We do not discover our story, we compose it. And because we compose it, it can always be revised. Such revision becomes essential during internal conflict. When a person feels torn between incompatible impulses, they often describe this as being divided against themselves. But this division is not aberration. It is the ordinary state of a mind composed of many forces. There is no single self to be consistent. There is only the shifting relationship between desires, beliefs, and emotions. What we call self-mastery is merely the temporary alignment of these elements. What we call authenticity is the momentary coherence of a pattern that could reorganize without warning. Identity is not a possession, it is a negotiation. And yet, despite this instability, human beings crave permanence. They long for an anchor that assures them they are the same person across time. This longing shapes relationships, commitments, and moral judgments. But the desire for permanence does not create permanence. It only creates the illusion of permanence. Hume's confrontation with this illusion is not meant to destroy the self, but to illuminate its structure. Once we accept that the self is not fixed, the question becomes not, who am I, but how do the patterns of my perceptions shape the life I live? Modern society, for all its complexity, struggles with the same question. Individuals feel pressure to define themselves, to adopt identities that can be presented, defended, and repeated. This pressure creates anxiety because it contradicts the fluid nature of selfhood. People sense that the identity they display is incomplete, yet they fear the chaos of admitting its incompleteness. Hume's insight offers release. We do not need to imprison ourselves inside static definitions. Identity is a process unfolding moment by moment. To honor this process is to live with more honesty, more flexibility, and more compassion toward the shifting landscape within us. But the implications run deeper still. If the self is a bundle of perceptions, then the boundary between self and world becomes permeable. Experiences do not simply happen to a stable subject, they constitute the subject. Change in perception is change in identity. The world shapes the self, just as the self interprets the world. This reciprocity dissolves the fantasy of isolation. We are woven from our encounters, shaped by our histories, altered by our environments. To understand ourselves, we must understand the forces that enter us through perception. And once we see this clearly, another question emerges. If identity is only a pattern of impressions, then what is the force that binds these impressions into coherence at all? It is at this juncture that the deepest tension of Hume's philosophy arises. For if perception forms the self, and if perception is shaped by passions, ground of identity lies not in thought, but in feeling. And the moment we turn to feeling, we confront the very engine that drives human action, desire, and suffering. It is here, in the heart of emotional life, that the next revelation begins to take shape, waiting for us to acknowledge its power. It is here, in the heart of emotional life, that the truth Hume never softened rises with full force. Passion is the engine of human existence. Nothing moves without it. Nothing begins without it. Every thought, every action, every hope, every failure is a shadow cast by some desire or fear, shaping us from beneath awareness. And the moment we allow ourselves to see this, the facade of rational control collapses entirely. For we are not thinkers who occasionally feel. We are creatures of feeling who occasionally think just long enough to justify what the heart has already chosen. Hume does not romanticize passion. He does not treat it as noble or transcendent. He treats it as the raw material of agency. Before any reasoning takes place, an impulse has already declared its direction. Before any justification appears, a desire has already seized the mind. The misunderstanding he destroys is the belief that emotion is a disruption of reason. Emotion is the source of movement. Without it, reason becomes inert, a lantern without a flame. The self he described as a bundle of perceptions gains its momentum from passion. Without passion, the perceptions would drift without coherence or purpose. This truth becomes undeniable the moment we examine how action arises. A person feels hunger before they deliberate about food. A person feels longing before they articulate desire. A person feels fear before they justify avoidance. Even in intellectual pursuits, the first spark is emotional: curiosity, pride, doubt, ambition. These forces compel the mind to think, not the other way around. Hume therefore reveals that emotion is not an obstacle to clarity, but a condition of human movement. The problem is not that passion exists. The problem is that we refuse to acknowledge its authority, pretending instead that reason governs worlds it merely serves. That refusal produces internal confusion. When someone cannot explain why they chose a particular path, they often assume their decision was irrational. But the truth is simpler. The decision arose from emotional necessity. Reason failed not because it was weak, but because it was never the origin of the movement. This is visible everywhere in modern life. People pursue careers not because logic demands it, but because desire for recognition burns beneath the surface. They seek relationships not because rational evaluation recommends them, but because longing overpowers caution. They avoid risks not because analysis reveals danger, but because fear whispers its verdict. Hume understood that the roots of behavior lie where we least want to look, inside the restless depths of feeling. In the contemporary world of 2025, this dynamic becomes amplified by a culture that pretends to worship rationality while being governed entirely by emotional currents. Advertisements bypass logic and speak directly to desire. Political rhetoric bypasses evidence and ignites fear. Social media bypasses reflection and triggers envy, outrage, or validation. People describe their choices in the language of strategy or insight, yet their actions reveal the unmistakable fingerprints of emotion. A person does not buy luxury goods because reason advises it, but because the longing to matter twists itself into the shape of consumption. A person does not chase status because it is rationally advantageous, but because insecurity aches for relief. Beneath the polished appearance of rational society pulses the truth Hume uncovered. Emotions drive the world forward. This insight becomes even clearer when we examine how desires form. They do not arise from command or reflection. They emerge from the interplay between memory, sensation, imagination, and fear. A desire can begin with a fleeting perception, a voice from childhood, a moment of loneliness, a subtle wound, or a forgotten hope. It can expand until it governs an entire life. And remarkably, the individual often believes they chose this desire instead of recognizing that it grew inside them without permission. Hume forces us to see that the illusion of self-control is strongest where we understand ourselves the least. Passion moves first. Understanding arrives later. But passion is not only desire, it is also aversion, dread, resentment, tenderness, aspiration. These currents shape the emotional climate of the self. They determine what we call personality far more than reason does. A person dominated by fear becomes cautious or rigid. A person dominated by longing becomes restless or ambitious. A person dominated by resentment becomes sharp and defensive. Reason can illuminate these forces, but it cannot erase them. It cannot rewrite the emotional history that formed them. This is why change is difficult. To change action, one must change feeling. And to change feeling, one must confront the internal architecture that produced it. Hume's psychology anticipates this with remarkable precision. He sees that emotion is not simply a reaction to the world, but an interpretation of it. The passions translate perception into value. They declare what matters and what does not. They give weight to certain experiences and strip weight from others. Without passion, the world would appear flat, indifferent, meaningless. Emotion animates it, shapes it, grants it color. Even suffering gains its significance from the intensity of feeling behind it. Passion is therefore not the enemy of meaning. It is the precondition for meaning. Where passion is absent, meaning evaporates. Where passion is distorted, meaning becomes painful. This interplay is most visible in the choices we label as life-changing. People choose partners because of emotional resonance, not logical compatibility. They pursue careers because of a pull toward achievement, not because of a calculated plan. They abandon paths because disappointment wounds them, not because analysis concludes that deviation is optimal. In all these choices, reason is a commentator, not a commander. It records the movement, but does not ignite it. When someone says they simply felt something was right or wrong, they reveal more truth than those who cloak their decisions in the language of rationality. Yet passion does not merely shape individual experience. It shapes social life. Collective emotion fuels protest, celebration, conflict, allegiance. Entire communities can be moved by shared anger or shared hope. Hume, without the language of modern sociology, understood that passion binds groups more effectively than reason ever could. Reason divides because it evaluates. Passion unites because it resonates. This explains why social movements rarely emerge from argument alone. They emerge from emotional ignition. And once the flame is lit, reason becomes the mouthpiece of whatever fire already burns. This dynamic also governs the inner conflicts that torment individuals. When two passions collide, the self becomes a battlefield. The desire for security clashes with the desire for freedom. The longing for connection collides with the fear of vulnerability. The pursuit of ambition conflicts with the craving for rest. Reason cannot reconcile these forces because reconciliation is not a matter of logic. It is a matter of emotional transformation. The person does not find peace by thinking more clearly. They find peace when one passion grows strong enough to quiet the others, or when the emotional landscape shifts into a new configuration. This shifting rarely feels like choice. It feels like becoming. This recognition leads to a deeper truth. If passion drives action, then moral life cannot be grounded in reason alone. It must be grounded in the cultivation of emotion. A person becomes generous not because reason tells them generosity is good, but because compassion becomes stronger than selfishness. A person becomes honest not because honesty is logically superior, but because the desire for integrity outweighs the fear of consequence. Moral transformation is emotional transformation, and until the emotional roots shift, logical arguments remain powerless. This is why people admire ideals they cannot live up to. They admire them through reason, but fail them through passion. Consider the symbolic figure of the driven individual who sacrifices everything for achievement. They explain their behavior in the language of discipline and rational ambition. Yet beneath this explanation lies an emotional engine: fear of insignificance, hunger for validation, terror of mediocrity. These forces push harder than reason could ever pull. When the individual finally burns out, they do not say their logic failed. They say they feel empty. Emotion drove them into exhaustion, and emotion deserts them on the other side. In this collapse, Hume's insight stands exposed. The passions are not stable. They swell, intensify, distort, and dissipate. To live without understanding this is to be ruled by storms one refuses to acknowledge. The world of 2025 adds another layer to this instability. Digital culture amplifies emotional triggers at unprecedented speed. People scroll through images that provoke envy, outrage, longing, or despair without noticing how their internal landscape shifts. These shifts then shape decisions that feel rational but are driven by unexamined emotion. The person wonders why they suddenly crave change, why they suddenly feel inferior, why they suddenly pursue something they never valued before. The cause lies not in thought, but in the emotional residue left by countless micro-perceptions. Hume's theory becomes frighteningly accurate. The self is constructed from impressions, and impressions are increasingly curated by forces outside our control. But this is not a call to reject passion. Hume never advocated emotional suppression. He advocated understanding. Passion becomes dangerous only when it remains invisible. When it is examined, acknowledged, interpreted, it becomes a force that can be guided, not controlled entirely, but shaped, not eradicated, but redirected. Reason cannot dominate passion, but it can illuminate the landscape in which passion moves. This illumination is the beginning of self-knowledge. It opens the possibility of choosing which passions to nurture and which to let starve. It transforms life from unconscious reaction into conscious participation. This transformation reveals something essential about human nature. We do not become free by killing passion. We become free by understanding it. Freedom arises when we recognize that emotion is not the enemy of the self, but the material from which the self is formed. And once we accept this, the search for clarity moves inward again, toward a question older than philosophy itself. If passion shapes the self, then what shapes passion? It is in that deeper descent, where the emotional roots of morality begin to stir, that the next truth waits, gathering its weight in the shadows. It is in that deeper descent, where the emotional roots of morality begin to stir, that Hume delivers one of his most disarming truths. Morality does not rise from reason. It rises from feeling. It does not emerge from commandments, principles, or abstract imperatives, but from the quiet, instinctive resonance that one human being feels toward another. This is the blow that many cannot bear. We want morality to be carved from stone, eternal and untouched by human frailty. We want it to stand above emotion, beyond desire, beyond fear. Yet Hume confronts us with the fact that moral judgment rests not on logic, but on sentiment. Our praise and blame do not emerge from deduction. They emerge from empathy or its absence. The mind resists this revelation with every defense it can muster. We want to believe that good and evil can be calculated, proven, justified through reason. But Hume strips away the illusion. He observes that reason alone cannot motivate. It can describe the world, but cannot assign value to it. It can trace consequences, but cannot tell us why anything ought to matter. To care is not an act of logic. To feel the suffering of another is not the product of a syllogism. Morality begins where reason ends, in the human capacity to be moved. Without that movement, the world becomes morally inert, a landscape of neutral events with no weight, no urgency, no meaning. Before the modern sciences of evolution, before psychologists studied empathy, before neuroscientists mapped mirror responses in the brain, Hume understood that morality is rooted in human nature itself. Compassion, not command, binds individuals into a shared existence. Cooperation arises because humans feel concern for one another, not because they follow rational principles. The misunderstanding he confronts is the belief that morality collapses without rational foundation. But morality does not need rational foundation. It needs emotional connection. It needs the capacity to imagine oneself in another. It needs the intrinsic pull toward fellow beings that makes cruelty feel wrong, even when no argument forbids it. This becomes evident when we examine our daily reactions. When we encounter a person in pain, we do not calculate moral obligations. We feel a tug. We feel discomfort, sympathy, sorrow. Those feelings generate moral response long before language steps in. When we witness injustice, we do not first analyze a logical contradiction. We feel indignation. We feel the pulse of something violated. Reason may articulate the principles afterward, but the principle did not generate the emotion. The emotion generated the principle. Morality is born in the affective core of the human experience. Yet this emotional core is fragile. Empathy can widen or shrink. Compassion can be cultivated or suppressed. In the age of 2025, social fragmentation has strained the emotional fabric of communities. Digital life creates distance disguised as proximity. Outrage becomes performance rather than connection. People grow numb from exposure to suffering they cannot touch, cannot feel, cannot respond to. When empathy diminishes, morality dims with it. Not because people become less rational, but because they become less emotionally attuned. Hume's insight exposes this with painful clarity. Moral decay begins when the heart withdraws, not when the intellect falters. The consequences of this are everywhere. People justify cruelty through ideologies that dull empathy. They justify indifference through narratives that dehumanize. They justify selfishness by appealing to reason, efficiency, survival. But these justifications merely mask a deeper truth. The emotional infrastructure necessary for morality has eroded. When we no longer feel the suffering of others, reason becomes a servant of self-interest. It becomes a tool to rationalize whatever passion demands. Hume reminds us that reasoning without sentiment becomes cold, sterile, and capable of monstrous results. This insight transforms our understanding of justice. Many assume that justice is built on rational principles that guarantee fairness. But Hume argues that the origin of justice lies in the emotional need for cooperation, stability, and mutual benefit. Justice is not a natural law. It is a human invention born from human sentiment. People create rules because they desire peace. They uphold norms because they value harmony. Without these emotional motives, justice loses its foundation and becomes a hollow arrangement. The idea of fairness arises because humans feel fairness, not because they deduce it. To see this clearly, we must confront how morality functions within individuals. People often describe their moral beliefs as rational conclusions, but when pressed, the emotional roots reveal themselves. A person who values kindness does so because kindness resonates with their inner experience of connection. A person who condemns betrayal does so because betrayal wounds the emotional bonds that sustain their sense of safety. A person who feels grateful acts with generosity because gratitude warms their emotional landscape. These are not calculations, they are affective realities. Even moral disagreement reflects emotional difference more than intellectual disagreement. Two people can argue endlessly about right and wrong, but their conflict often traces back to differing emotional sensitivities. One may feel a strong pull toward loyalty, while another feels a stronger pull toward fairness. One may feel compassion as their guiding force, while another feels duty more sharply. Reason articulates the disagreement, but passion animates it. Hume exposes moral debate as a clash of sentiments disguised as a clash of ideas. This does not mean morality is arbitrary. It means morality is embodied. It is rooted in the lived experience of human beings who must navigate a world of shared vulnerability. The emotional resonance that drives moral judgment emerges from the structure of human life, the need for connection, the fear of harm, the longing for recognition, the capacity to feel the joys and sorrows of others. When these capacities flourish, morality flourishes. When they weaken, morality becomes brittle and abstract. This fragility becomes especially visible in environments of power. Those who hold power often distance themselves emotionally from those beneath them. They justify harshness through utilitarian logic, efficiency, or necessity. But beneath these rationalizations lies a simple truth. Empathy has been severed. Without empathy, the powerful feel no internal resistance to exploitation. They do not feel the weight of harm they cause. Reason, divorced from sentiment, becomes an instrument of domination. Hume's insight warns that morality depends not on structure, but on sensitivity. When sensitivity dies, power grows unrestrained. A symbolic figure captures this vividly: the bureaucratic enforcer who follows rules without feeling their human impact. He believes he is rational, dutiful, responsible, but in reality, he has surrendered his moral life by numbing his emotional life. He acts as though morality is external to him, residing in procedures. But procedure cannot feel, and without feeling, action becomes mechanical, indifferent, capable of cruelty, disguised as order. Hume would say he is not immoral because he breaks rules. He is immoral because he no longer feels what rules are meant to protect. This insight forces us to reconsider the role of reason within morality. Reason can clarify consequences, foresee outcomes, structure decisions, but it cannot generate moral motivation. It cannot make us care. It can only serve the feeling that already exists. When compassion guides reason, morality strengthens. When resentment guides reason, morality darkens. When fear guides reason, morality shrinks. The emotional state shapes the moral landscape, and reason merely maps it. The modern world, with its constant stimulation and relentless demands, strains the emotional capacities that morality requires. People feel exhausted, fragmented, overstimulated. Compassion becomes harder to sustain. Patience thins. Empathy becomes selective. Individuals withdraw into defensive shells, protecting themselves from overwhelming emotional burdens. This withdrawal is understandable, but it has consequences. When people protect themselves by numbing themselves, they weaken the very impulses that give morality its power. Yet Hume's view is not despairing. If morality emerges from feeling, then moral growth is possible whenever feeling grows. Compassion can be cultivated through exposure, reflection, and presence. Empathy can be strengthened by deliberate attention to the lived experience of others. Emotional intelligence can deepen through the work of introspection. Morality becomes a practice, not a doctrine. It becomes something to be nurtured rather than imposed. This shift from doctrine to cultivation transforms how we understand ethical life. Morality is not about adhering to rigid rules, but about refining the emotional capacities that allow us to respond justly. It is not about suppressing desire, but about aligning desire with the well-being of others. It is not about conquering passion, but about shaping it. The task is not to replace emotion with reason, but to teach reason how to work with emotion rather than hide behind it. In this sense, morality becomes inseparable from self-awareness. To behave ethically, one must understand the emotional forces that shape one's reactions. One must know when fear is distorting judgment, when anger is fueling blame, when insecurity is masquerading as righteousness. Ethical clarity requires emotional clarity, and emotional clarity requires the courage to confront oneself without illusion. This confrontation reveals yet another truth. If morality depends on feeling, then the boundary between personal emotion and ethical action becomes porous. Private wounds can distort public judgment. Personal longings can spill into moral conviction. Emotional history can shape ethical stance. To understand morality, one must understand the self. And to understand the self, one must recognize that identity is constructed by the very passions that now form the foundation of moral life. Hume's ideas interlock here with an inevitability that feels both elegant and unsettling. The self is a bundle of perceptions. These perceptions generate passion. Passion shapes morality, and morality, in turn, reflects the emotional texture of the self. Once this structure becomes visible, we stand at the threshold of a deeper instability. For if morality begins in feeling, and feeling is unstable, then moral life itself is vulnerable to fluctuation. What we call moral certainty may be nothing more than emotional certainty. What we call moral truth may be the reflection of emotional configuration. This does not destroy morality. It simply exposes its human origin. But exposure carries consequences. It forces us to ask not only why we judge others, but why we judge ourselves. And as this question gathers weight, it turns our attention toward a new dilemma, one that emerges the moment we confront the gap between what is and what ought to be. A gap reason cannot close and emotion cannot ignore. And as this question gathers weight, it turns us toward the chasm that has haunted every moral philosophy since its earliest breath, the gulf between what is and what ought to be. Hume forces us to stand at the edge of this divide without consolation. He insists that reality does not whisper instructions. Facts do not generate values. Description does not yield prescription. The world moves according to its own indifferent currents, while the human heart demands direction, meaning, purpose. This tension is the wound at the center of moral life, and Hume exposes it without offering anesthetic. The mind instinctively seeks bridges across this divide. We see patterns in nature and declare them moral law. We witness biological tendencies and mistake them for ethical imperatives. We observe social habits and imagine they reveal universal truths. But Hume strips every one of these illusions away. The world describes only how things occur. It does not tell us how things should be. To leap from observation to command is to smuggle values into facts and pretend they were there all along. This leap is seductive because it promises stability. It offers a shortcut through the chaos of moral uncertainty. Yet Hume demands we recognize the leap for what it is, a projection of human need onto an indifferent universe. This realization destabilizes the ground beneath moral certainty. If the world cannot tell us what we ought to do, then obligation must come from within us, not from outside. Values become human constructions, not cosmic inheritances. They emerge from emotion, culture, tradition, aspiration. They are shaped by the long history of human survival and the fragile architecture of human feeling. But they cannot be justified by pointing to what exists. The existence of inequality does not justify hierarchy. The existence of violence does not justify aggression. The existence of competition does not justify domination. To call something natural is irrelevant to the question of whether it is right. In the world of 2025, this confusion becomes especially dangerous. People point to technology, biology, or algorithmic patterns and argue that these reveal what society should become. But descriptive power does not grant moral authority. A machine learning model can predict behavior, but it cannot judge it. Biological explanation can reveal impulse, but it cannot sanctify it. Data can describe tendencies, but it cannot transform them into values. The modern mind, intoxicated by information, forgets this distinction and allows the is to masquerade as the ought. This masquerade becomes evident in the reasoning of those who use nature as justification. They argue that because humans evolved aggression, aggression must be acceptable. Because society rewards competition, competition must be morally valid. Because inequality persists, it must reflect something necessary. Hume dismantles these arguments with a single strike. To describe a tendency is not to praise it. Nature does not hand us ethics, it hands us conditions. Ethics is the human response to those conditions, not their passive acceptance. The real danger lies in the emotional comfort offered by collapsing the is and the ought. If what exists is already what should exist, then morality becomes effortless. No responsibility, no introspection, no struggle. But Hume refuses this comfort. He insists that morality requires the courage to choose values rather than inherit them blindly. To choose is to confront uncertainty. To choose is to accept responsibility for the world we create. And responsibility is heavy precisely because nothing in nature guarantees we will choose well. This weight becomes unbearable for some. They seek escape through ideology. They cling to rigid doctrines that pretend to transform the is into the ought with a single stroke. They claim that tradition or religion or reason reveals a moral blueprint embedded in reality. But beneath these claims lies the same refusal Hume warned against, the refusal to face the silence of the universe, the refusal to acknowledge that meaning must be created, not discovered, the refusal to accept that morality is a human invention forged in the struggle to live together. Yet this invention is not arbitrary. If values arise from human feeling, then the ought reflects the emotional architecture that sustains human life. Compassion, fairness, loyalty, courage, honesty, dignity. These are not cosmic truths, but human necessities. They emerge because human beings must coexist. They persist because they resonate with the internal experiences that shape identity. They evolve because emotional life evolves. But they never descend from the sky as commandments. They rise from the soil of the heart. This view demands an uncomfortable honesty. It means that our values are fragile. They depend on the stability of human feeling. They must be cultivated intentionally. They can be distorted by fear, poisoned by resentment, fragmented by trauma. To preserve morality, one must preserve the emotional capacities that generate it. This is why ethical life is precarious. It hangs not on external authority, but on internal coherence. Hume reveals that the struggle for morality is ultimately a struggle to maintain the emotional conditions that make morality possible. This struggle becomes even more complex when we recognize the self as fluid, shaped by ever-changing perceptions and desires. If identity shifts and passions shift, then the values anchored in those passions may shift as well. The human being must therefore recreate moral commitment continually, reaffirm it, reshape it, refine it. The ought becomes a task, not a discovery. It demands vigilance. It demands renewal. It demands a willingness to stand in the space where certainty is impossible and choose anyway. That space is the crucible of ethical life. It is where the self confronts the world not as it is, but as it might become. It is where human imagination enters the realm of value, creating a horizon that reality itself does not provide. Hume's insight forces us to see that our greatest moral achievements arise not from obedience, but from invention. We are not interpreters of a pre-existing moral order. We are its authors. And as soon as this truth settles, another question sharpens beneath it, demanding that we look not only at the values we choose, but at the structures that allow those values to hold society together at all. And as soon as this truth settles, another question sharpens beneath it, demanding that we look not only at the values we choose, but at the structures that allow those values to hold society together at all. Hume refuses to let us cling to the comforting belief that order is natural, that harmony emerges from the world as effortlessly as light or gravity. He insists instead on something far more unsettling. Justice is artificial, not false, not unreal, but crafted, constructed, invented by human beings who must coexist despite conflicting interests and unstable passions. The order we inhabit is not a gift from nature. It is a fragile agreement forged out of necessity. The mind instinctively rebels against this. We want to imagine justice as part of the universe's fabric, as though fairness were written into the laws of physics. We want to believe that moral structure grows organically out of human reason. But Hume dismantles this optimism with a single observation. In conditions of abundance or perfect benevolence, justice would be unnecessary. The need for rules arises only when resources are limited, desires collide, and individuals pursue their own interests. Justice is therefore not a reflection of cosmic truth, but a response to human vulnerability. We do not discover justice in nature. We create it, because without it, we would devour each other. This creation is not an act of pure reason either. It is shaped by sentiment, by the shared desire for stability, by the emotional need for predictability in a world that offers none. People agree to rules not because rules are sacred, but because rules reduce fear. They trust conventions because conventions restrain the chaos that passion would otherwise unleash. This insight strips justice of its illusions and reveals its true foundation. Necessity fused with sentiment. Society survives not because it follows a natural order, but because it maintains a delicate, human-made equilibrium that could collapse at any moment. In the world of 2025, this equilibrium grows thinner each day. The pace of societal change overwhelms the norms meant to stabilize it. Laws lag behind technological power. Institutions weaken under cultural polarization. Communities fracture under economic strain. People cling to the illusion that justice is self-sustaining, but Hume exposes the naivete. When shared sentiments weaken, the structures built upon them begin to crumble. Justice depends on mutual recognition, on empathy, on the willingness to restrain oneself for the sake of others. Without these emotional threads, rules lose meaning and enforcement becomes violence disguised as order. The fragility of justice becomes clear when institutions fail to maintain fairness. People look at corruption and assume the system has malfunctioned. But the truth is deeper. Justice never existed independently of human virtue. It depends entirely on the individuals who enact it. When those individuals lose integrity, justice erodes. When power becomes detached from accountability, justice warps. When the emotional fabric of society frays, justice dissolves into rival claims backed by force. Hume's insight warns us that justice is not a fortress. It is a tent held up by human hands. This fragility is evident in the conflicts that dominate modern discourse. Groups clash over rights, resources, identity, and recognition. Each side insists it represents justice. Each side appeals to morality. But beneath these arguments lie competing sentiments, each shaped by different experiences, fears, and desires. Reason becomes the weapon used to defend emotional allegiance. Justice becomes not a shared construction, but a battlefield of competing narratives. The misunderstanding here is profound. People assume agreement on principles will create order. But agreement cannot emerge when emotional foundations diverge. Justice requires shared sentiment before it can support shared principles. Hume forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice is always provisional. It must be renegotiated constantly as circumstances evolve, as desires shift, as societies transform. It cannot remain static because human life is not static. What was once just may become oppressive. What was once necessary may become destructive. Rules that once protected may begin to suffocate. The artificial nature of justice is not a flaw. It is a reminder that humans must remain vigilant. They must adapt their conventions, refine their norms, and rebuild trust whenever it erodes. Justice survives only through continuous reconstruction. This reconstruction demands humility. If justice is artificial, then no society can claim perfect righteousness. The best we can achieve is a structure that reduces harm and supports coexistence. But this requires acknowledging that our conventions are human inventions, subject to failure and improvement. When societies treat their norms as sacred absolutes, they close the door to evolution. They cling to laws even when those laws deepen suffering. They defend institutions even when those institutions betray their purpose. Hume's perspective challenges us to abandon certainty and embrace responsibility for the order we create. A symbolic figure appears here, the enforcer of tradition, who believes justice is eternal and must never be questioned. He clings to old structures not because they are effective, but because they give him the illusion of stability. He confuses longevity with truth. He treats conventions as though they were natural laws. But Hume reveals the danger of this mindset. When justice becomes rigid, it ceases to be just. When rules lose their connection to human need, they become tools of control rather than frameworks of cooperation. The enforcer does not preserve order. He preserves the appearance of order while its foundations crumble beneath him. To confront this illusion, one must accept that justice requires participation, not obedience. It requires empathy, not detachment. It requires reflection, not blind adherence. The artificial nature of justice means it must be shaped intentionally by people who understand the conditions of their time. It must respond to new forms of vulnerability, new forms of power, new forms of suffering. When society evolves, justice must evolve with it. Hume's insight shows us that the cost of refusing this evolution is collapse. But just as justice emerges from shared sentiment, it also reveals the limits of human cooperation. For even when individuals agree to conventions, even when they uphold norms, even when they desire stability, there remains a deeper human impulse capable of unraveling everything: the need to believe in forces beyond experience, in explanations that transcend reason, in promises that shape obedience through fear and hope rather than through mutual understanding. This impulse opens a darker door, and as we approach that door, Hume's skepticism begins to gather strength again, preparing to confront the power of belief itself and the ways it can be used to shape or shatter human life. And as we approach that door, Hume's skepticism gathers force, preparing to confront the oldest and most potent illusion in human history: the belief that some truths lie beyond experience, that power descends from unseen realms, that miracles break the order of nature to reveal a divine intention. This illusion has shaped civilizations, commanded devotion, justified violence, and governed souls with a grip stronger than any law. But Hume dismantles it with merciless clarity. He argues that when testimony contradicts experience, it deserves suspicion, not reverence. The human mind, hungry for meaning and desperate for reassurance, confuses wonder with truth and authority with evidence. This confusion arises because belief is rarely a matter of inquiry. It is a matter of longing. People want the universe to speak to them. They want signs, interventions, assurances of purpose and protection. They want to believe that behind the fabric of existence lurks a power that watches, judges, rewards, punishes. This desire creates a vulnerability as deep as the need for belonging. And into that vulnerability steps the machinery of miracle stories, prophetic declarations, and claims of supernatural authority. Hume exposes the psychological mechanism beneath these claims. The mind abandons skepticism when belief promises comfort. What makes these beliefs dangerous is not their strangeness, but their immunity to correction. A miracle claim does not rest on repeatable observation. It rests on testimony, often secondhand, often embellished, often defended by appeal to fear or loyalty. Hume's question is devastatingly simple. Which is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended, or that humans have erred, exaggerated, or deceived? The answer, once stripped of emotional investment, becomes painfully obvious. Human beings are prone to error. They seek patterns where none exist. They transmit stories for power, influence, or awe. And once a miracle enters tradition, it becomes insulated from doubt by the fear of social, or spiritual exile. But the threat of miracle beliefs extends beyond religion. In the world of 2025, power has learned to cloak itself not in divine robes, but in data streams, political narratives, digital mythologies, and conspiratorial spectacles. Modern miracles take the form of impossible promises, curated illusions, and manufactured fears. They are no longer bound to altars. They circulate in networks, images, algorithms. People believe not because they understand, but because belief offers identity, community, certainty. Hume's skepticism becomes more urgent precisely because the forms of modern deception are subtler and more pervasive. Fake news operates through the same psychological machinery that once drew crowds to tales of supernatural intervention. It bypasses reason and enters through emotion. It amplifies outrage, fear, hope. It spreads because it gratifies the desire for secret knowledge, for narratives that explain chaos by assigning intention. People cling to these stories because they reduce existential uncertainty to a drama of heroes and villains. Conspiracy theories thrive because they transform randomness into design. They offer the same comfort miracles once offered, the assurance that events are not senseless, that someone is in control, even if that someone is malevolent. Political power exploits this vulnerability with precision. Leaders present themselves as saviors, as figures destined to restore order, as possessors of truth inaccessible to ordinary people. Their authority rests not on evidence, but on the emotional resonance of their narrative. They present every challenge as conspiracy, every criticism as betrayal, every failure as the fault of hidden enemies. Hume's insight reveals the underlying pattern. When people relinquish skepticism, they relinquish freedom. Power grows when credulity grows. The less people question, the more easily they can be commanded. Religious institutions have long understood this dynamic. They wield miracle stories not simply as spiritual messages, but as tools of influence. The promise of divine intervention becomes a mechanism of control, shaping behavior through fear of punishment or hope of salvation. The authority of miracle narratives lies not in their truth, but in their emotional impact. People obey because obedience offers psychological safety. Hume challenges this by demanding that every claim be measured against experience. If a claim defies experience, belief should yield, not reason. But the history of humanity shows the opposite. Reason yields and belief spreads. This pattern repeats in modern media. Sensational stories eclipse sober analysis. Outrage eclipses curiosity. Virality eclipses verification. People share what makes them feel, not what makes them think. The result is a world saturated with illusions, each demanding allegiance, each exerting subtle coercion. Hume's skepticism becomes a form of self-defense, a shield against manipulation. To doubt is not to reject truth. It is to protect oneself from the machinery of influence that thrives on unexamined belief. Yet skepticism alone is not enough. Hume does not propose cynicism as a refuge. He recognizes that humans will always believe something. The task is not to eliminate belief, but to ground it in experience, humility, and self-awareness. Otherwise, belief becomes a weapon wielded against us. When we believe too easily, we become instruments in the hands of those who understand our hunger for meaning and our fear of uncertainty. The most dangerous power is the power that commands without force, the power that enters through the stories we tell ourselves. A symbolic figure helps reveal this. The charismatic manipulator who claims insight no one else possesses. He demands trust without evidence. He offers certainty where reality offers none. His influence grows not because he speaks truth, but because he speaks desire. His followers do not evaluate him, they feel him. They cling to his words because he alleviates the burden of thinking. He becomes the miracle they have been waiting for. Hume would see through him instantly. The manipulator thrives because the human mind surrenders skepticism in exchange for psychological comfort. This surrender exposes a deeper truth. The problem is not belief itself. The problem is the fear that drives belief. People accept authoritative claims because uncertainty terrifies them. They accept fabricated miracles because randomness feels intolerable. They accept conspiracy narratives because the complexity of reality overwhelms them. Belief becomes a refuge from the burden of confronting the world as it is. But once this refuge is recognized as illusion, a new and heavier question emerges. If we must doubt miracle stories, political myths, conspiratorial fantasies, and even the authority of institutions, then what remains as a reliable guide? What can anchor human life when both reason and belief reveal their limits? It is at this edge of uncertainty, where skepticism strips away every false assurance, that Hume's final lesson begins to take shape, gathering its weight as it turns toward the question of how to live with knowledge that is always incomplete. It is at this edge of uncertainty, where skepticism strips away every false assurance, that Hume's final lesson begins to take shape. Once the illusions of causation, reason, identity, morality, justice, and supernatural authority have been dismantled, we stand before a world that offers no guarantees and a self that offers no foundation. The temptation is to recoil, to demand some new system, to rebuild certainty, to cling to another doctrine or another savior. But Hume refuses to play the architect of replacement. Instead, he forces us to confront the most difficult truth of all. Knowledge is always incomplete. Belief is always provisional. And understanding begins only when the craving for certainty dies. This is not surrender. It is liberation. To accept the limits of the mind is to be freed from the tyranny of pretending to know what cannot be known. Hume reveals that humility is not weakness, but clarity. We misjudge reality not because reality hides from us, but because we refuse to acknowledge the boundaries of our perception. When reason pretends to be absolute, it becomes delusion. When belief pretends to be infallible, it becomes danger. But when both are tempered by humility, they become tools rather than traps. Humility does not mean silence. It means precision. It means distinguishing between what can be affirmed, what can be suspected, and what must remain open. It means recognizing that every conviction carries the shadow of uncertainty. The mind wants solidity. It wants conclusions etched in stone. But Hume compels us to see that the pursuit of certainty leads not to wisdom, but to fanaticism. Those who believe too strongly in the correctness of their vision become the most dangerous, for they stop listening to experience and begin reshaping the world to fit their illusions. In the world of 2025, this lesson is more urgent than ever. Information accelerates, opinions harden, identities crystallize around beliefs. People cling to their convictions not because they are true, but because uncertainty terrifies them. The digital age amplifies this fear. Every question produces an avalanche of answers. Every doubt generates a storm of claims. The noise is unbearable, so individuals cling to whatever offers stability. But stability achieved through dogma is counterfeit. Hume's voice cuts through the noise. The only sustainable clarity is a clarity that admits its own incompleteness. This recognition alters the meaning of knowledge itself. Knowledge becomes less about accumulating facts and more about refining judgment. Less about possessing truth and more about discerning where truth ends and probability begins. The wise person, for Hume, is not the one who knows the most, but the one who overestimates the least. To understand the world is to live alongside uncertainty without collapsing into fear or illusion. It is to walk with provisional confidence, never claiming more than experience can justify. This posture of humility transforms the relationship between self and world. When we stop demanding certainty, we stop demanding that the self remain fixed. Identity becomes something to explore rather than defend. Moral life becomes something to cultivate rather than impose. Justice becomes something to renew rather than worship. Skepticism becomes a method of protection rather than destruction. Every layer of Hume's thought converges here. The self is fragile, the world is uncertain, and meaning emerges not from possessing truth, but from navigating its absence with honesty. This navigation demands courage. It requires standing without support, refusing both the comforts of superstition and the arrogance of rationalism. It requires acknowledging that human beings cannot escape vulnerability. We cannot escape error. We cannot escape the shifting nature of desire, memory, judgment, and belief. But instead of interpreting this as failure, Hume offers a more radical interpretation. Vulnerability is the condition of freedom. Only a creature without certainty can choose. Only a creature without fixed identity can transform. Only a creature without guaranteed truth can seek understanding sincerely. His legacy, therefore, is not a system, but a disposition, a way of moving through the world without illusion, a way of thinking that treats doubt as discipline rather than. discernment, a disciplined ability to sift through experience without collapsing into skepticism for its own sake. Hume does not advocate nihilism. He advocates proportion. He urges us to believe where evidence supports belief, to doubt where evidence falters, and to withhold judgment where evidence is absent. This proportionality is the essence of his philosophy. It reveals a path between gullibility and cynicism, between fanaticism and paralysis. It carves a space where the mind can operate honestly. From this space arises a new understanding of freedom. Freedom is not the absence of limits, but the recognition of them. Freedom is not the assertion of certainty, but the ability to move without it. Freedom is the courage to create values, knowing they are human, to make choices, knowing they are fallible, to seek meaning, knowing it may never be definitive. This freedom is not comfortable. It is demanding. It requires continuous vigilance, continuous reflection, continuous willingness to revise one's view of the world. But it is the only freedom grounded in truth. And as this truth settles into the mind, it reveals a lightness. The burden of pretending to know lifts. The pressure to defend illusions dissolves. What remains is a kind of intellectual honesty the modern world rarely permits. The clarity of living without guarantees, while still choosing, still striving, still seeking understanding. Hume leaves us standing in this clarity, not with despair, but with possibility. The world remains uncertain. The self remains fluid. Knowledge remains incomplete. But something else now gathers at the horizon, rising from the quiet recognition that uncertainty itself can be lived with, shaped, even embraced. For once we accept the fragility of what we know, we begin to see the fragile beauty of knowing at all. Hume leaves us with no altar to kneel before, no doctrine to swallow, no final truth to silence our questions. And yet, in stripping away every illusion we once clung to, he gives us something far more durable than certainty. He gives us a way of seeing, a way of living without guarantees, without metaphysical comfort, without the arrogance that human reason often projects onto the world. In his hands, philosophy does not soothe, it sharpens. It forces us to confront the fragility of knowledge, the fluidity of the self, the instability of causation, the limits of morality, and the vulnerability of every belief we carry. But this confrontation is not a descent into despair. It is an invitation to honesty. Hume demands that we acknowledge what is truly human in us, the habits that guide our expectations, the passions that move our choices, the sentiments that shape our ethics, the stories we invent to endure uncertainty. He reveals that freedom does not grow from certainty, but from humility, not from possessing truth, but from recognizing the boundaries of what we can know and still choosing to live deliberately within them. In the light of his thought, modern life becomes less bewildering. The chaos of information, the volatility of opinion, the shifting identities of the digital age, the collapse of moral consensus, the rise of manufactured belief. All these storms become intelligible once we understand the mind's deep hunger for stability in a world that offers none. Hume teaches us that clarity begins when illusion ends, even if what remains is unsettling. The courage he asks of us is simple but uncompromising, to stay awake in a universe that never promised to explain itself. And so his legacy endures, not as a system, but as a discipline of perception. To question without bitterness, to doubt without paralysis, to feel without surrendering judgment, to reason without pretending reason rules alone. He turns philosophy into a mirror, one that reflects not what we wish to be, but what we are. The questions he leaves us with are not relics, they are living wounds. How much of what we see can we trust? How stable is the self we cling to? How reliable is our reason when emotion moves first? How fragile are justice and morality when sentiment falters? Where does meaning arise in a world that refuses to guarantee any? These questions follow us because they are the architecture of human existence itself. Hume does not close them, he sharpens them. And in doing so, he invites us into a form of philosophical maturity that does not demand certainty, only sincerity. In the end, philosophy is not the art of answering every question, but the art of living with them without turning away. It is the discipline of being both truthful and humane in a world that often allows for neither. And if we can carry even a fraction of Hume's humility into our own reflective lives, we may discover that wisdom begins not with what we know, but with how honestly we face what we never will.